so forth, um, was the description Secretary Blinken gave of one vignette from the attack. And he described it this way. He said, a family of four, a young boy and a girl, 6 and 8 years old, and their parents around the breakfast table. The father's eyes gouged out in front of his kids, the mother's breast cut off, the girl's foot amputated, the boy's finger cut off before they were executed. And then the executioners sat down and had a meal. We've seen a lot of glee and hate from that incident, and that's startling. And in the aftermath, we've seen tremendous death and human suffering in Gaza, and we've seen hate crimes, especially against Jews and Muslims, spiking worldwide. We've had the killing of a 6-year-old Palestinian American kid and the shooting of 3 Palestinian students just recently in Vermont. In Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, not far from where I live, there were 3 men that were sitting and having a meal on sort of on the hood of their car, and somebody came by and asked, "Are you Palestinian?" They said, "No, they're Egyptians." Didn't matter. They beat the heck out of them. And the local imam was talking about this is potentially worse, the type of hatred they were seeing from 9/11. And the thing that was really startling when they arrested the people that were the ones responsible for beating up these guys, one of the people that was the perpetrator was Jewish, who had been himself a victim of a hate crime a few years before. So we've seen attacks on Jews. We've seen, at Cornell, for example, somebody posted that he was, quote, going to shoot up 104 West, which is the Cornell dining hall that caters predominantly to kosher diets, located next to the Jewish Center. In another post, he threatened to stab and slit the throat of any Jewish males he saw on campus, and to rape and throw off a cliff any Jewish females, and to behead any Jewish babies. He also threatened to bring an assault rifle to campus and shoot all you pig Jews. There's, as you know, there was a demonstration, or some of you may know, there was a demonstration a few weeks ago in Missoula, and white supremacists took advantage of it to organize around that too, a pro-Palestinian demonstration. There's more data that we have, and it continues to pile up from Jewish organizations and from Palestinian or Muslim ones. And I haven't seen any convincing correlation between online activity and hate crimes. But there's a friend in the UK who monitors anti-Semitism and Islamophobia and released a report showing that since October 7th, there's a 64-fold increase in anti-Semitism and 422% rise in anti-Muslim rhetoric across a number of platforms. And he also said something which I thought was quite remarkable. He said this is the first time he could remember these 2 forms of targeted religious hatred accelerating in parallel. Sometimes we've seen anti-Semitism go up, sometimes we've seen Islamophobia. They're both going up in tandem. He's actually doing a webinar for my center on December 20th. And again, if you want a link to that, just email me and I'll send it to you. So worldwide, what have we seen? In Milan, protesters shouted, "Open the borders so we can kill the Jews." In Nicaragua, graves in a menorah in a Jewish cemetery were vandalized with Nazi and pro-Palestinian symbols. In France, a synagogue was spray painted with "Victory to our brothers in Gaza." In France also, 2 men doused an apartment door with gasoline and lit it. It was the only one in the building with a mezuzah. In Germany, Molotov cocktails were thrown at a synagogue. In Tunisia, anti-Israel rioters burned down an historic synagogue. In Germany, apartment buildings in which Jews lived were marked with the Star of David. Recall that Jews were required to wear a Star of David during the Nazi era. The word "Kill Jews" was spray painted on the remnants of the Berlin Wall. In Australia, at a pro-Palestinian rally, people shouted, "Gas the Jews." And as I said, it's easier to find instances of anti-Semitism than Islamophobia, but there are other concerns too around this, in addition to the crimes. In France, pro-Palestinian demonstrations were banned. I mean, we're used to free speech in this country and democracies, but in France they were banned. In Florida, Governor DeSantis went after the Students for Justice in Palestine, ordering chapters shut down. Republican representatives are talking about deporting students who have the wrong view of the conflict. Brandeis University suspended a student group simply for what it said. And even though what it said disturbed me too, the idea that you could shut down on a campus a student group because you don't like what it says about the Israel-Hamas war, to me is startling. A campus ought to be a place where you can look at ideas as opposed to muzzle them. If you're Muslim, all this is unfolding in a backdrop of the former and perhaps future president of the United States not only banning Muslims, but suggesting they should register. And when I talk to Jewish audiences, I stress, just imagine if you're Jewish and you had somebody who had been elected president and might be elected president again, talking about we need to register all Jews, and imagine how Muslims must feel. So we see these pushes into binary thinking, good and bad, and so forth, and we see the challenges to democracy that come from them. To me, democracy, including free speech, needs to be protected as the foundation from which we have at least a chance to manage hatred better. So I want to explore these ideas with you tonight. But again, in the Q&A, anything you want to ask is okay. So I've said we've seen anti-Semitism and Islamophobia increase in the aftermath of the Hamas attack and the Israeli response. It was expected that we'd see those things, and it's unfortunate, but how do we understand it? So we see this holding all Jews responsible for Israel. Every time there's a war, there's an uptick in attacks. It's like clockwork since the Second Intifada. But it's not unique. I mean, somebody was asking at a thing I went to today about how do you explain about the attacks on Jews, and they were saying anti-Semitism. I said it's a little more complicated because, we saw in this country when former President Trump was railing about the China virus. We saw attacks go up against Asian Americans. We saw attacks against Muslims go up after 9/11, and those mistaken for Muslim Jews. So we see that type of, we're going to hold this group responsible, even though individuals have nothing to do with it. We're targeting them. That's something unfortunate we've seen about how hate plays out. But with anti-Semitism, something else is going on too. I want to spend some time talking about anti-Semitism, both because it merits discussion and also it's because it illustrates how hate works. So you've heard a lot recently about anti-Semitism. It's on the rise. Not only about the incidents the last couple of months, but before that, that was the drumbeat too. Figures that were released last spring by the ADL, for example, and it sure feels like anti-Semitism is rising. But think about it. What do we mean exactly by rising? And more generally, what is anti-Semitism, and how should we be thinking about it? So it's best understood at its essence as conspiracy theory about Jews trying to harm humanity by conspiring with each other. And that conspiracy explains what goes wrong in the world. So from the death of Jesus to the Black Plague, Jews being accused of poisoning wells, to the blood libel, Christian children would be missing. It was because the Jews stole them and were draining their blood for religious purposes. The accusation that Jews were behind communism and capitalism simultaneously. Consistency isn't required for conspiratorial thinking. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was a Tsarist forgery in the early 1900s, was supposedly the text proving that Jews have this conspiracy behind government, behind the media, and so forth. This forgery, and it was the fuel for many pogroms promoted in this country by some mainstream figures, most prominently Henry Ford, who published something called the International Jew based on them. This country too, you have the Nation of Islam. Farrakhan was saying the Jews were responsible for slavery. And then you have Marjorie Taylor Greene, who's talking about Jews and space lasers as the reason for California forest fires. But you also see it in the Hamas charter, the basic idea that Jews conspire to harm humanity, and that explains what goes wrong. So if you think about it, it's one of the things that I tell students is to to put yourself in the mind of somebody who thinks this way. Why did they think that way? So if you think about at Charlottesville, where there was a Unite the Right rally, which was what about the Robert E. Lee statue, and they got to with the tiki torches and everything else, they got to chanting, "Jews will not replace us." Well, where does that come from? Jews will not replace us. What do Jews have to do with Robert E. Lee? But if you think about it, if you're a white supremacist and you believe you're losing a battle to people that are inferior to you because you see the United States is going to be a majority non-white society by 2050, then how could that possibly be that you lose to somebody who's inferior? There has to be somebody behind the scenes putting their fingers on the scale, making this happen. So who will be tipping the scales? Of course, the Jews. That's where conspiracy theories and anti-Semitism comes in. So although anti-Semitism is, as I said, a conspiracy theory about Jews, it's a mistake to think about it, and I think too many people do, as related only to what people are saying about Jews. The Tree of Life massacre in Pittsburgh uh, was clearly an act of anti-Semitism. The shooter went in after there was a fevered pitch about from President Trump and others about invaders over the southern border. And the synagogue there had hosted a meeting about immigration, so he went up there to stop it because he felt he needed to. A few months later, there was the shooting at the Walmart in El Paso, where Mexican Americans and Mexicans were directly targeted. Nobody would say that was anti-Semitism, but the ideology of the two shooters was essentially identical. They just chose different targets. One went after the invaders directly, one went after the people they thought were enabling the invaders, but the ideology was the same. So one of the things when we look at anti-Semitism or other forms of hate, I think it's important to have a wider lens and a narrower ones. So let's talk a few minutes about what's the relationship between anti-Semitism and hate. And the Jewish community where I worked for 25 years at the American Jewish Committee is rightly concerned when there are people sometimes that try to hide anti-Semitism behind a generalized idea of hatred or racism. Sometimes it's to not deal with it directly and to make it disappear. And that happens and it should be called out when it does. But I think the flip side of that argument is much more important because Jews are not the only people experiencing hate, and it's not as if anti-Semitism is floating alone as it's a subset of the human capacity to hate, but it's not the only one. And to look at it, I think it's important to understand it through a lens of hate studies. So I'm going to spend a couple of minutes talking about what I mean by that. So the field of hate studies, and as Lori was saying, there are more centers now than there were, 25 years ago, and I'm honored to head one of them. The field of hate studies is defined as follows: as inquiries into the human capacity to define and then dehumanize or demonize another, and the processes which inform and give expression to or can curtail, control, or combat that capacity. So notice that there are actually two types of hatred that we're studying. One is sort of the one you think of probably first, more visceral, angry, I hate them. And the other is the more normative. This is just how the world works. Slavery is an example of that type of hatred. But the observation behind the field of hate studies is that no matter, it's a basic part of the human condition. So no matter where, no matter when, no matter what economic or political system, no matter what major religion, we've always had the capacity as human beings to get into these buckets where we divide between who's the us and who's the them. And it's like, at its most extreme, it could lead to hate, to demonization and dehumanization. But there's a lot of tremendous information about why we get into these us versus them buckets. But it tends to be siloed, and that's one of the reasons why we have the interdisciplinary field of hate studies, because psychology looks at the individual, and social psychology looks at the group, and political science looks at issues of power. And there are other fields like philosophy and now even brain science, which look at other aspects. In philosophy, looks at human emotions and they can be related to hate, like fear and envy and anger and disgust. But what we want to do is pull it all together, which is a complicated and challenging, but I think it's essential to get a better understanding of how hatred plays out on all these planes simultaneously to give us some ideas of what best to do about them. So it's sort of like trying to do what medicine does, which is people get sick. It's part of the human condition. So we pull from chemistry and physics and biology to give us answers about what best to do. Same with architecture, because people need structures. So we pull from art and physics and math and so forth to answer that. We're trying to do something with something much more difficult and less tangible, but still is essential because we've seen how much hatred has, harmed humanity. So perceiving who is us and them is a core part of the human condition and something our brains do naturally. And we tend to forget sometimes that we're human beings, we're animals with brains developed millennia ago when knowing who's us and who is them, somebody right over that hill might have been an essential piece of information. There's a guy who wrote a foundational piece for the Journal of Hate Studies from Evolutionary Psychology, who was talking about how our brains developed back at that time and some of the manifestations of it today. And his observation was, if you think about it rationally, we should be much more afraid of automobiles than spiders or snakes because automobiles are more likely to cause us harm. But we don't have a visceral reaction to automobiles, but many of us do to spiders and snakes because our brains were fashioned that long ago, and our brains were fashioned to make quick decisions about who's the us's and who's the them's. But in-groups and out-groups aren't all the same. Some are more central to our lives, perhaps religion or ethnicity, and some less so, which sports team we root for. But there's evidence, especially when the type of identity is of great importance to us and it's perceived under threat, some things certainly happen. One is we strive for certainty. We believe that we are right and they are wrong or worse. And hate of others, anti-Semitism included, is frequently seen not as hatred, but as noble protection of self, of our group, from a threat. And hate, anti-Semitism included, is a human response to a world in which we all live and every day filter our lives through an endless evaluation of who's us and who is them. We seek simpler formulas to avoid the angst of the perpetual questioning around this. We downplay or ignore when our side is behaving badly and emphasize or exaggerate when the other side does. Facts and arguments that I might be wrong are not merely dismissed, they're sometimes redefined as part of a conspiracy. Pristed like pretzels to prove that I'm right. And those of you who remember the heyday of the militia of Montana and the things that it was putting out will remember many examples of that. So hate and conspiratorial thinking, us and them, works in politics too, because otherwise politicians wouldn't use it. Former President Trump didn't invent it, but he made it into an art form, calling Mexicans rapists and assertions again that all Muslims register, immigrants being invaders, the Kung Flu, Jews with special business skills, and referring to Israel as your country. And now we live in a moment, and we probably will see more of it as the campaign goes into full swing. He's talking about conspiracies to promote hate of him and his supporters, the fake media to steal election, and George Soros, a Jew prominent among the forces behind this alleged conspiracy, similar to the idea of the rich Jew historically with Rothschild from the last century was used to promote anti-Semitism too. So we also see the use of us versus them, of hate and vilification debates about other issues that confront us, about abortion, about immigration, religion in the public spheres, about what's taught in schools and colleges, how we treat people with different gender and sexual identities. And politicians know that we get our blood boiling when our guts tell us that we are being treated unfairly or threatened by them. So when we buy into a system of thought that makes us feel good, because we're fighting for our clearly correct and virtuous in-group against an external threat, thinking becomes increasingly binary and frequently passionate. And one of the best descriptions of how this works as a system that I've quoted in congressional testimony and other places actually was an insight from Ken Toole, who directed your organization for many years, and he described the militia movement back in the 90s as a funnel moving through space. And what he meant by that was that at the large end of the funnel, there were people coming into militia meetings because of mainstream issues, things like gun control and federal land use issues and so forth. And once inside that system, they got exposed to conspiratorial thinking. And once they got further into the system, they got exposed to anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, because that's the granddaddy of conspiracy theories, around politics. And out popped the Timothy McVeighs of the world. So what was useful about that insight is that he saw this as a system, and instead of just, for me, I'm less interested, although I am interested in the small end of the funnel. I'm interested in what will put people into the large end of the funnel, into this system. And I think we're seeing more and larger funnels today than when Ken came up with this great metaphor 30 years ago. So with that observation, I think it's a tactical mistake to think about anti-Semitism or Islamophobia or other, but I'm talking about anti-Semitism here as an example, to think about anti-Semitism as just what people are saying about Jews. One observation is that haters, as I've said, seek binary answers, but all of us have human brains. So those fighting anti-Semitism, I think, also look for comfort of simplicity and a collective sense of certainty of what's right and wrong. And certain things happen when that occurs. We're likely to ignore what some economists call the denominator. We take an anecdote and make it ubiquitous. We make decisions based on what we feel and presumptions, rather than asking, do we have complete knowledge of this? And we looked at it from every angle. We're in our own buckets of ideas about this, about many, cutting edge and deeply disturbing issues. We don't think really why others would have a different point of view. There's an economist named Kahneman who says, what you see is all there is. And it's a good exercise to think about why people may see the world quite differently than you do. Haters crave symbols. We know that because it's part of the binary and the simple answer, and symbols are important. The swastika, for example, or flags. But symbols have a lot to do also, they intersect with memory, and memory is complicated. So there's a field called memory studies, and it's concerned not so much with the past, but rather how the past is remembered in the present and how it shapes it. And there's a field in it called multi-directional memory. And it doesn't define memory as static, but something that changes. Different groups' memories can intersect with each other for positive or negative. As we're seeing today, the memories of 1948 in Israel and Palestine are both about the same time, but diametrically different, as are the narratives around those memories. So there are some good examples of how you can take conflicting memories and build something larger. And I'll give you one. When I was at the American Jewish Committee, there was a big concern about, there was a Japanese American exhibit of Japanese American called concentration camps, the internment camps. It was going to be either at Ellis Island or I think it was maybe the Statue of Liberty. One of those two places was going to be the exhibition. And the Jewish community was in an uproar, because how could you use the term concentration camp? That diminishes it to talk about this experience as a concentration camp, when look what happened in Germany. So the two groups were at loggerheads, but they decided, okay, let's have a meeting and talk this through. And did, and came to conclusions. The first thing that people should, the name would not be changed. But at the beginning of the exhibit, there was a big poster that said this. It said, a concentration camp is a place where people are imprisoned not because of any crimes they have committed, but simply because of who they are. Although many groups have been singled out for such persecution throughout history, the term concentration camp was first used at the turn of the century in the Spanish-American Boer Wars. During World War II, America's concentration camps were clearly distinguishable from Nazi Germany's. Nazi camps were places of torture, barbarous medical experiments, and summary executions. Some were extermination centers with gas chambers. 6 million Jews were slaughtered in the Holocaust. Many others, including gypsies, Poles, homosexuals, and political dissidents, were also victims of the Nazi concentration camps. In recent years, concentration camps have existed in the former Soviet Union, Cambodia, and Bosnia, and despite the differences, all had one thing in common: the people in power removed a minority group from the general population, and the rest of society let it happen. So that's a good example where you have competing memories, and people could have gone into their binary boxes, but figured out there was a way beyond it. The flip side of it is a lot what we're seeing about Israel and Palestine on campus and off these days too. I have a colleague from Harvard years ago said, why is there a separate field of Israel studies and Palestine studies? I mean, it's the same place, same histories, they're competing narratives, but taking place in the same geographic area. People go to each other's conferences. Why isn't it not combined? Why is it so segregated? I thought he had a good point, but this was even before October 7th. Can you imagine now people trying to figure out ways to cross that divide? Although I think it's a good exercise if people can. So all this to say, I worry that the binary around anti-Semitism is harming efforts and providing easy and wrong answers. And to think about it historically, what was the answer for anti-Semitism decades ago? Holocaust education. Well, Holocaust education is important. I support the Holocaust Museum and its educational purposes. But to cure anti-Semitism, can you imagine a young Muslim Arab person during the Second Intifada in the outskirts of France learning about Wannsee and then saying, well, I'm going to disregard, I'm seeing Israeli soldiers with guns lording over my co-religionists? I don't think so, but we try to go to simple solutions. And I see one that's happening today that worries me because I think it blinds us to the things that we should be thinking about to confront anti-Semitism. And I'll spend a few minutes going, because I know it was part of the congressional testimony today about the campus. This was one of the students. There's a push to have the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism adopted and applied campus and elsewhere too. And to me, it would be disastrous if it doesn't. I say this as the lead author of the text that became the definition. So let me spend a couple minutes talking about the background to it. So I was mentioning the Second Intifada. When the peace process collapsed in 2000, there were attacks on Jews, as we saw, just recently, but then too, an uptick in Europe. And there was a group called the European Monitoring Center on Xenophobia and Racism. They issued a report about anti-Semitism in 2004 and found that it was not only the white supremacists, but some young Arab and Muslim folks in various Western European countries that were also responsible for the attacks on synagogues and individuals. But they said there was a problem collecting data because they didn't have a common definition of anti-Semitism. They had all these data collectors in different countries, and they should all be reading from the same song sheet, collecting the same information so we could compare across time and across borders to see what's happening. And they used a temporary definition that said anti-Semitism is a series of stereotypes about Jews, but they had a problem with what do you do if a Jew is attacked, as we've seen recently in the United States and elsewhere since October 7th, as a stand-in for an Israeli. Somebody's upset something Israel does. And they said, well, if the person has these attitudes towards Jews and applies them to Israelis and then reapplies them to the Jew in front of them in the streets of Paris, that's anti-Semitism, but not if they're just upset at Israeli policy. And to me, that struck me as nuts. I mean, it's like saying somebody is attacked for a racist reason because they believe certain things about Black people. That's racism. But if they have upset at some legislation being passed or a speech or something political and they attack the same person, that's not racism? Of course it is. So what happened was that the leader of that group was coming to the American Jewish Committee And a couple of weeks before the big annual meeting where this person was going to participate, there was a Jewish day school in Montreal that was firebombed in retaliation for an Israeli assassination of a Hamas leader. So not anti-Semitism, according to the group. So that gave the opportunity to say, let's figure out a tool to use to help your bean counters in different countries know what to include. And one of the other clear reasons for it was to stop a confusion about hate crime. Um, if you're Jewish or and attacked simply because you're Jewish, that's enough. You're selected to be a victim of crime because you're Black, you're Jewish, you're gay, you're transgender. Doesn't matter what the person was thinking. Doesn't matter if they have positive stereotypes of Jews that have been kidnapped and held for ransom because Jews were thought to be rich, and people would debate that's a positive stereotype. Doesn't matter. So those were the two of the basic reasons for pushing this definition, and it had some examples about speech about Israel, because we saw a correlation between that type of speech, not causation, but a correlation in real time with attacks on Jews, and we thought it was an important data point. But it was never to label anybody an anti-Semite. But what happened? Because people like simple solutions, right? So in 2010, the Department of Education in the United States made a clarification under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which protects people in the educational system, students, from pervasive and severe harassment and intimidation and so forth based on a number of characteristics, including race, but not religion. And in 2010, the Department of Education said, well, Jews and Sikhs and Muslims as ethnicities should also be protected. I thought that's great. I supported that legislation. I actually was a complainant for some Jewish high school students in a place where the school district did nothing, and there was a Kick a Jew Day and swastikas all over the place. And the potential remedy for Title VI violations, you lose all your federal funding, which is huge. So what happened? You had people in the organized Jewish community who said, we have this new power. We have this handy dandy definition. Let's go hunt for speech on campus that we don't like about Israel, and claim that helps create a hostile environment, very much like you heard if you listen to the congressional testimony today. So what they were doing is, in some of the cases they were bringing, Title VI cases did have some aspects of it, spitting and other things, which are clearly objectionable, but they were looking for things like texts that a professor assigned, or speakers that came to campus, or films and so forth. And all these cases lost. And when they did, the proponents of the cases said, well, at least they, chilled speech we don't like about Israel. They chilled the Israel haters, because they gave an incentive for the administrators to try to crack down on this type of speech. And then they tried to get the University of California to adopt it, and it didn't. And in 2016, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance took this definition, this language, and started trying to get governments and others to push it, and had actually put in front of Congress in the late fall of 2016. The Senate unanimously passed a legislation that said that this definition had to be applied in Title VI cases on campuses unanimously. Even Bernie Sanders voted for it, because how can you be against anti-Semitism? But in the House, they started saying, maybe there's an issue here. Maybe there's a free speech issue. Maybe this is not how we want to deal with anti-Semitism. And it got stalled. And then what happened was that the Trump administration passed an executive order that said you have to apply this definition when looking at cases of anti-Semitism on college campuses. And Jared Kushner wrote a piece in the New York Times saying anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, full stop. Well, to me, that's a problem. I'm a Zionist. I believe in the state of Israel. Anti-Zionism offends me many times, especially, depending on who's saying it and how. But, people mean various things by Zionism, which is basically, at its core, the Jewish people's right to self-determination. And of course, it's exercised in Jewish historic homeland, the land of Israel, with, tell people about the Bible and the connections, and the synagogues all, face towards Jerusalem and so forth. And some anti-Zionism certainly is anti-Semitism, especially ones that use, the conspiracy theories about Jews and just cut and paste Israel or Israelis for, the old-fashioned tropes about Jews. But again, have intellectual imagination. Imagine you're a Palestinian, and some surely, would hate Jews. And the Hamas charter the original charter does. It talks about the protocols and talks about hunting Jews. But most Palestinians I know are not anti-Zionist, not because they hate Jews or believe Jews are the only group that don't have a right to national rights, or believe in a Jewish conspiracy, but because they've seen the Zionism as it developed in the last century and a half as a disaster for them. Second thing to consider too in this context of looking for simple answers. No community is monolithic. There's a debate inside the Jewish community about Israel and Zionism inside, who's inside and outside the tent. There was just a piece in the New York Times yesterday by Michelle Goldberg that delves into this deeply. But, think about it. And there's Satmar Jews, which are a Hasidic sect that don't believe in the state of Israel because they don't believe that there should be Jewish state until the Messiah comes. But there are young Jews in groups like If Not Now and Jewish Voice for Peace that the usual story, and the Michelle Goldberg story reflects some of this too. The anecdote is I grew up in a Jewish household. I went to Jewish day school. And I get to college and I hear for the first time there's an occupation and I feel betrayed and I start looking into this and I can't square the existence of Israel with what I learned from Judaism about how I treat the stranger as a Jew or how I repair the world. I disagree with them about their conclusion, but who am I to say that they don't have a right to express their Judaism that way? And I certainly have a right to say I think it's a disaster to try to have government decide this internal Jewish question, which is essentially what the organized Jewish community is doing. So, the implications, again, are awful in terms of what I think, the interest of Jewish students on campus. It's saying this is a simple solution. We're going to hunt speech. We're going to have faculty concerned about what they're teaching because there are going to be people trying to bring Title VI cases and, making mistakes. I'm deeply concerned about the binary of some of the pro-Palestinian folks who are trying to censor pro-Israel ones on campus with instances of heckler's veto and academic boycotts. And, we've seen some intimidation, which clearly should not be allowed, harassment and those types of things on the campus. But, I worry deeply about the pro-Israel side, thinking we're going to stop what we see in terms of anti-Semitism related to anti-Zionism and saying all anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism and using the instruments of state. Think about how that worked in the UK. A number of years ago, they passed a resolution adopting IRA, and you can't have a Israel Apartheid Week demonstration. I'm not a fan of that, but it's free speech. It's an idea. And the Simon Wiesenthal Center said every campus should adopt the same principle. So what are we seeing about this use of IRA? What I worry about is not only the implications on democracy and civil liberty, but now it becomes the silver bullet of how we're dealing with anti-Semitism. It's comforting. It's easy. We have a speech code, and the arguments around it, I think, are not only ridiculous. They harm us from really thinking about how anti-Semitism and hatred works. So it can't be understood without thinking about using this handy-dandy tool to look at anti-Semitism. Well, nobody was talking about when Kanye said he was going DEFCON 3, that we couldn't figure it out without that. But its main use has been to chill pro-Palestinian speech, and that's accelerating. It's feeding a binary, and the way you deal with complicated issues like anti-Semitism is you defeat the binary. You don't feed it. So I'm worried that it's become a symbol like a flag, and something that's binding to a community, comforting, and rational objections to it are being dismissed. And one of the general rules about bigotry of all types, that I tell students is take a scenario, change around the players and see if the same rules apply. So would we be using in this context a definition about racism that included examples about opposition to affirmative action or Black Lives Matter or removal of the Robert E. Lee statute? No, we wouldn't. We'd say that as an implication of free speech, and not every person who is objecting to the removal of the statute is racist. It might be useful for telling the temperature, but not as a handy dandy way to censor speech. So another concern is, instead of fights over picking on which side of a bright line we want to put certain expressions about Israel and craving for simplicity and comfort and easy answers, fighting anti-Semitism requires strengthening democracy, and we're doing the opposite. Democracy is more than a system of elections. It's a belief system stressing the rule of law, the importance of rights, especially those who are not in the majority, individual rights, speech and religion, press and checks and balances. And at its best, democracy is a belief that we each have an equal stake in and have a right to be viewed as equal parts of the whole. And of course, there will always be tensions, but the strength of democracy is related to our ability to oppose bigotry and hatred. And the threats I see today are not just from the right, but also from the left. And some of this we've seen around, the campus recently. Some around. I mean, I think it's overstated those who go after quote wokeness, but I think that they also have a point in a way. There's a lot of valuable thinking about things like power and privilege and race, but some also want to reduce everything to those filters because that's all you need to know. It's like a binary, like classical Marxists. You want to look at everything in terms of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat and economics and class conflict. And of course, it's a part of the puzzle, but not the entire puzzle. And that's what we're striving to do, or a lot of people are striving to do, to understand things that put it in these types of binaries. And it has implications for Jews, particularly on campus. So first, in some instances, things get reduced to the simple binary of whether the proponent of an idea is white or not. Again, people bring different experiences, but the sort ideas based on skin color is a simple binary and wrong. Second, Jews and whiteness isn't a binary in that sense, because Jews are a people, not just a religion, but people of different skin colors. And although most American Jews are white, but as I said, white supremacists see Jews as anti-white, and see some on the left see Jews as super white. So the simple binary is that people who aren't of color cannot experience racism and hate. Then when Jews face it, they're doubly hurt by hatred and by the dismissal of those who should empathize. And when the dismissal is accompanied by anti-Semitic stereotypes about Jews conspiring to control things, that's even worse. Another point, being certain you're right and wanting to impose your views on another through law, as some in the pro-Israel community do, erodes democracy. Again, progress against hate, anti-Semitism included, happens when protection for democratic norms is prioritized. And today, just the opposite trend is what I see, that the left and right want to outlaw speech they don't like. Historically, you give government the ability to suppress speech. It's the speech the government doesn't like. I mean, I'm old enough to remember, as a kid in the 50s and 60s and certainly 70s, the civil rights movement, the fight for free speech in the 60s, the sitting lunch counters, the opposition to the Vietnam War were all expressions of an idea that the government was going after those ideas. So I'm troubled that those who firmly believe that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, full stop, without exception, believing that that's what this definition requires, which it actually doesn't, but use it that way, want to use it as an instrument of state to harm free speech, democracy, and the fight against anti-Semitism. So, there's some, that divide on this too, that I see as just really, obscene in some ways. Pro-Israel groups, empowering some people, like the Zionist Organization of America, feted Steve Bannon because, well, he's great on Israel, he's great on Zionism. But look at his role in creating the alt-right. And then I see, some on the left, doing that too. But look at Florida, look at DeSantis. was an article in the Jewish Forward that talked about a bill that was one of DeSantis's pieces of handiwork that said, well, you can't really, teach a lot of things about race and about gender. And there was an article that talked about, well, what is the impact of this on Holocaust teaching? And I was co-teaching a class with a colleague who was at the Central European University, who's an expert on the Holocaust and gender. For those of you who don't know, the Central European University was kicked out of Budapest by Orban and reconstituted in Vienna. BART it's part of the Open Society network that BART is part of. But it dawned on me that gee, she might be able to teach something in Vienna that she couldn't teach in Miami. And just think about the idea of what we're reading in the newspapers today and the last couple of days about rape and Hamas. Well, it was there were issues about how women were treated during the Holocaust too, but not being able to teach those things potentially, is troubling. But I think the groups that are pushing this definition as a handy dandy way to stop certain speech they don't like, just like DeSantis is, I don't want white students to feel bad about race or feel uncomfortable about gender issues, don't see it as having the same sort of threat to democratic norms that this other type of legislation does. DeSantis pushed to decertify the Students for Justice in Palestine. The ADL and Brandeis pushing universities to investigate whether they're supporting terrorism when there's no evidence that they are. They're just saying things that we don't like, and that's a challenge to democracy. A few more points. So it feels like anti-Semitism on campus when Jews who are pro-Israel are told they don't fully belong because of politics over Israel. And there are a lot of Jewish students who are really hurting at the moment because they don't feel like they can fully express, their views. But that's not, it's unfortunate always, but this is not the first instance I've put some in my book, and it isn't just about this issue. It's about many issues where young people feel they don't want to jeopardize it, the ability to date or class or grade or whatever by saying something that might be unpopular. But what started this about a year ago, there were 3 places. Again, it's not ubiquitous, from University of Vermont, New Paltz, and Berkeley Law School, that basically said that we don't want you as part of our group if you're a Zionist, if you believe that Israel has a right to exist. The Vermont and New Paltz were sexual survivors, groups for sexual survivors of assault. And in Berkeley Law School, it was the Students for Justice in Palestine type of group that got I think 9 other groups to sign on. Not only are we not going to have Zionists, who are members, but we're not going to have a speaker on any issue, climate change or anything, who happens to be a Zionist. They have a right to make that exclusion. They have a right to redefine their climate change group as an anti-Zionist group. But this is McCarthyism. This is binary thinking. Somebody has this view on Israel. They're so evil, they can't be part of our group. I think it's wrong to make that exclusion, although it's legal to make that exclusion, because most Jewish students are Zionists, and it feels like anti-Semitism. But it's something deeper. I think it goes into the binary thinking and the simple solutions, as opposed to this is Jews. Because some of the groups that were doing the exclusion had many Jewish members who were supporting of this. So what happens when we get into these binary buckets? We sacrifice what's effective. I don't know how it helps climate change, keeps Zionists out of this to feel the comfort and purity that you have this pristine idea of the moral universe. That, and when I talk to students about this, I said also think about how this affects your classmates. You might you're not going to solve questions about Israel Palestine, but you do have control over how you define a community and how you treat each other. Another set of things to consider. Anti-Semitism is not just a number of hate crimes or incidents, and the numbers aren't, fully complete, though they're, certainly, significant, at least the numbers that we've seen of hate crimes in the last bit of time, but they shouldn't be looked at in isolation. So when I think about anti-Semitism, one of the things when they say incidents are increasing. So what's an incident? Is it on social media? That's lamentable, but we also see things like that against other groups too, against transgender, sexist, racist, anti-Muslim stuff. And it's not clear how precise the data is, but I don't think that the question about incidents tells us too much. I think there are other things to consider too when we think about anti-Semitism rising in the current moment. Attitudes, though, we may see a shift after the polls come out, after, we finish with the events of the aftermath of October 7th. But generally, before October 7th, at least, they were generally better for years about attitudes about Jews. If you look historically, I have it much better than my parents, and my parents had it better than my grandparents, and my kids have it much better than I do. I mean, my parents and grandparents were quotas keeping Jews out of colleges. Another data point is, intermarriage, right? So it's not just what people are saying about Jews. Jews are being loved to death. That's an issue. Look at George Santos, the now former congressman from Long Island. When he was running, he was lying about many things, including saying he was Jewish because he thought it would help him. So imagine if he said he was, Muslim or Palestinian, would that have helped him? Another data point. It's undeniable that since the attack on the Los Angeles Jewish Community Center in 1999 by an Aryan Nations member, and since the Second Intifada and the Tree of Life attack in Colleyville and so forth, there's a need for much more security in Jewish institutions than 30 years ago, and even more in the last 2 months. And it's undeniable that, as the ADL stats show, identifiable Jews, like Orthodox ones in New York and New Jersey, are more at risk, and some identifiable Jews in other places, including on some college campuses, are too. It's all to say that we perceive a rise, but it's not a simple way to gauge it. I've been involved in, as Lori was saying, this issue for decades. So other than in 2000, when Joe Lieberman was running as vice president, and intermarriage was such a front burner issue that people were saying anti-Semitism has disappeared completely. It's usually been said that anti-Semitism is increasing, but again, with looking at simple data points without looking at the big picture. So when we limit our thinking to what people are saying about Jews or about Israel, we're blind to a more important data point. And this is what troubles me most about anti-Semitism at the moment and hate generally. The push by leaders to define one segment of society as both preeminent and under attack, while vilifying them as something noble, even essential, and hate is self-protection. So while there are good signs about some being, some pushes back to anti-Semitism today, the reaction to Kanye West, for example, where Adidas, cut him loose. There was an MHOP meeting at the White House, and there was another meeting with MHOP, Deborah Lipstadt and campus leaders prior to the Cornell threat, which is exactly what you want leaders to do. But I'm worried about elected officials, pushing conspiracy theories, ignoring, what Trump, is doing to promote those. What Sam Friedman, who wrote a great book on Hubert Humphrey in 1948 in the Democratic Convention that I recommend to you, had a good term that he actually found that Walter Winchell had used for an old anti-Semite back in the 40s named Gerald L.K. Smith. He talked about patriotism, the combining of hate with patriotism. And I think that's part of what we're seeing now. So, the way that I see the challenge at the moment is that, and again, I anticipate this is going to potentially increase with the 2024 election, when there's more painting of there are people inside us, regardless of whether it's transgender or immigrants or Jews or Muslims or whatever, as a danger to us, that's inevitably going to lead to an increase in anti-Semitism, more than what people are saying or not saying about Israel. Go back to Ken Toole's funnel. The more you push people that are primed to see who's the us, who's the them, we're under assault, here are the mainstream issues that are driving us to it. And now I understand how the world really works. And they look at simple binary issues, binary ways of how do I understand this? It's very simple. It's their fault. Sooner or later, you're going to go into the granddaddy of all the conspiracy theories, which is anti-Semitism. So that, in conclusion, that's why I am so thankful for the work that the Montana Human Rights Network has been doing for all these decades, because that's in your DNA. You realize that all these things are interconnected, and that, if we're fighting the simple answers to complicated questions where people are pointing fingers to our fellow citizens as part of the problem, that's going to go a long way to combating all forms of hate, anti-Semitism included. Let me stop there and take your questions.
Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you. That was a marathon, but incredibly valuable to listen to. And I just want to encourage everybody who's in the room, please put questions and comments into the Q&A now. There's a few there. And Ken, I know you can see them. Do you want me to
You want
read?
me to answer them? I can
Yeah,
do it
get
if you want.
started. And
Why not?
and folks, please chime in, and put your words in there.
Okay, so the first one, it seems that Hamas hides behind the Palestinian people. Well, I would agree with that. I mean, they've been, their infrastructure has been underneath, public places, and Gaza is compact anyway. So, but they seem to be doing that. I think that's true. So, then this person asked the same person asked, "Oops, how can the Palestinian people be encouraged, supported to separate themselves from Hamas?" I mean, it's difficult. The polls show that, I mean, it's not ubiquitous in terms of Gazan support for Hamas. The challenge is, again, it's complicated. So those of you who remember, the Hamas won an election against the Palestinian Authority and then never, held another election. And Hamas, for those of you who don't know, it's not just that it's anti-Semitic and anti-Israel's right to exist. I mean, part of the thing that confounds students who understand, what Hamas is, and here is some classmates, singing the praises of Hamas, recognize that Hamas wants an Islamic republic. What Hamas would mean for gay people, what Hamas would mean for women, would have to cover, themselves up and so forth. That's sort of lost because it's seen, for folks, it's, again, in the binary of this, they're stepping up for Palestinians. This is a sign of Palestinian resistance. They've finally done something. They put the issues of the Palestinians back on the front pages. So I would not be surprised if there's more, support internally, because the Palestinian Authority is, ineffectual and corrupt, and the Palestinians, I know, are not all that optimistic about the Palestinian Authority succeeding. And this is before October 7th. But one thing that I've said for a long time is that I think and this is before October 7th, when the history of this period of time between the 67 war and now, or 10 years from now, or 20 years from now, is written, the major blunder the Israelis made was not to do everything they could to make the Palestinian Authority succeed. Part of what Israel was doing was actually giving a leg up to Hamas, because they thought that Hamas was a good counterbalance to the Palestinian Authority. And whenever you help a group that has a theology and an ideology that's hateful, it's going to come back and bite you in the butt, just like the Americans learned with the Taliban. So let me go into the next question. Um, is from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, an inherently anti-Semitic slogan? I wouldn't say it's inherently anti-Semitic. As a Jew, I find it, and who cares about Israel, I find it deeply disturbing. When Hamas uses it, I think that's in fact, the case of what they mean. But there, do I think an 18-year-old who thinks, gee, everybody should have one vote in Israel and there should be one state where everybody gets along, or people like Peter Beinart, who I respect deeply, although I disagree with him that he thinks a confederation will work. I might be wrong, he might be right, but I don't think it's anti-Semitic to believe that. So I wouldn't put that as again, everything requires context. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. I understand why, it's a thing that I hear that hurts, and I understand why Jewish students on campus hear it and feel that it hurts. But I am much more concerned about Brandeis, for example, saying this is inherently anti-Semitic and you can't say this chant, or we're going to not have your group on campus if you do that. So to me, it's a learning experience. At Dartmouth and at Bard too, but Dartmouth I think did even better. When the attacks happened, faculty, including the great friendship between the head of Jewish studies and Middle East studies, decided we have to do a number of forums, and decided that students could ask anything, and they showed how experts can disagree but disagree agreeably, and really mind the issues. And one of the things that we're going to be, I don't think this is going to be one of the buzzwords, but a colleague at Bard is putting together a course in the spring that I'm going to be part of just for a couple of sessions. Instead of all these words being slung around like anti-Semitism, genocide, and ethnic cleansing, and settler colonialism and so forth, let's have a class where we take a deep dive into each of these terms and see what they mean. So I think the on a campus, you don't want to ban speech, even ones that might find offensive, even things that you might even be, everybody would agree would be anti-Semitic. The point is, you can't have harassment, you can't have intimidation, you can't have bullying, you can't have discrimination. If you don't want to get deeply disturbed by ideas, you shouldn't be going to college. I mean, you're wasting a lot of money. So learn how to, the faculty and others should help you learn how to process what you're hearing that disturbs you, and find educational ways around it, rather than thinking, this is going to be solved by saying, we're labeling it this way or that way, because most things are complicated. Is there more binary thinking in relation to political issues now than perhaps 20 years ago? It's a good question. I think there's always been, sort of binary thinking in a way. I mean, I'm doing a sort of non-retirement retirement project where I'm reading a biography of every president, and it's a good way to read history. And there were lots of times where we've had, those types of things. But I think that there are more sort of stimulants for that now. Social media, again, is a delivery system. The ideas are more important than the delivery system, but it's easier to get into your own buckets. Cable news does that well. It's a simple thing and it's their fault. And so I think that there are more incentives to get into binary thinking. And that's, again, one of the reasons why I think on a college campus, the teaching people the critical skills and to think about why others may have a different point of view, whether it's why that student in the art class is very friendly, has a view, you think about Israel Palestine, that's evil, and imagine how they're thinking about it. Or just more broadly. I mean, look how many millions of people think Donald Trump is great. I find that appalling on so many bases, but how can I not spend time thinking about how do I look at the world? And so to really try to get beyond the binary, to think about how other people view the world is a helpful thing, I think, for all of us. What's your take on the patriarchy and role? Yeah, there's certainly sexism, and in terms of a lot of how some hatred plays out. You see it with incels. We see it with some aspects of white supremacy and so forth. Uh, I remember when I learned that the part of the militia of Montana, and the Trockmans and so forth, and the Christian patriots had this view of the Constitution was divinely inspired, but the Bill of Rights was sacrilegious. And among the things that the Bill of Rights did is it gave votes to women. So there's some of it that plays in it, but I think that it's basically there are ways to divide who's us and who's them on so many different levels, and issues around male and female and power and so forth are part of it. But again, I don't see it as the whole answer. So, next question is for people who have acquaintances, friends on all sides of the current conflict: American, Jewish, Israeli, Palestinian, Arab, Muslim from other countries. How do we express support without traumatizing people who are closer to the conflict but may have different opinions or experiences? It's a great question, and listen, I do too. I mean, I have, thank God, I don't have relatives who were in the southern Israel, but I know people there who, obviously are deeply concerned and have had impact on their families. And I sent a student to work with Women Wage Peace a couple of years ago, and one of the co-founders of that was killed on October 7th. So you reach out to people and check if you're okay. And I've had students who are Palestinian. Bard is the only college in the United States that has an affiliation with a school in the West Bank. There's an honor college at Al Quds, which you can imagine is having some difficulties, at the moment. And there's a master in fine arts and human rights program at Bard, and I had two students that I've worked with there who come from the West Bank, but are relatives in Gaza. And you just be human. You reach out and check in and see if they're okay. People have strong different opinions about this. I have friends who aren't Jewish who are understandably deeply upset about what they see in terms of what Israel is doing in retaliation, or in terms of its response. And we talk about it. And again, people tend to go into the binary boxes of Israel has a right to defend itself. That's all that's happening here. Hamas is responsible, which it is. I mean, Israel has an incentive to kill less people, although it's not doing such a great job. And Hamas is, very clear in terms of what it wants to do and what it wants to accomplish. But you have to listen to people, and to reflect that none of this is just so simple that Israel has a absolute right, or that Israel shouldn't do anything at all. I'm I've been involved with discussions about what they should have done differently, and I think there are a lot of different things, and I can talk about that if people want. And I too am appalled at the massive amount of death, and have conversations about it. One of the things that I stress too, when people get into conversations about it, is I just wonder strategically from Israel's point of view. Are they creating a whole other generation that has, that may make, whatever goes after Hamas will be even worse, because I can't imagine living under this type of assault. But talk to people about the issues, but mostly if you just checking that people are okay and take a lead from them. So I'm not clear on your point of how we combat hate. Are you saying that suppressing speech is not the answer? That seems to me to have been effective in modern Germany to suppress anti-Semitism. But please explain more clearly what exactly does it helps us combat hate. I'm not seeing that democracy really helps unless we never really had a democracy. It's a great question. So let me try to be a little bit clear. Germany, for example, or other countries that have a different free speech tradition also have problems with hate. It's not like that they've solved it in Germany. Anti-Semitism, or other forms of anti-immigrant hate just by suppressing speech. In fact, you could argue that it makes people into martyrs when you suppress the speech. What it does is it doesn't provide us the opportunity to think about how do we address speech that we don't like. The options aren't in the binary of we either let it go carte blanche, or we stop it from appearing at all. One of the states that was looking at legislation that actually passed it using the IRA definition was South Carolina, and it was a rabbi who wrote, well, this is great. We have to suppress the speech because Hitler didn't kill anybody with his hands. He did it with words. And I wrote back with the former general secretary of the AAUP saying, yeah, but the reason Germany was able to succeed at that period of time was because it suppressed dissent. It made a particular point of view, illegal. And that's the thing about the beauty of democracy, that if you allow ideas to be free of government repression and suppression, we saw it in the McCarthy era, we saw it in World War One, where we didn't do that, and it led to not only threats to democracy, it led to increased times of anti-Semitism too. If we allow the speech to not be suppressed by government, but then say, what can we do? There are lots of things we could do on a campus. For example, I was talking about we could teach what happened back in, take the example that you guys know well, but from Whitefish. I mean, one of the things that worked really well when the neo-Nazis were going to march, bringing up skinheads from Oakland on Martin Luther King Day in 2017, with you guys and some others. I was running a small foundation and worked with you all, did use social media to get people to make pledges timed to how long this supposed march would last. So it did what? It made the people in Whitefish feel supported. It gave people something to do, gave a disincentive to march, because the money that they would be raising was in effect going to things that they would find detestable, like anti-bias education and so forth. So there are lots of things to do to oppose speech we don't like. But when we go into the simple thing of we're going to have the government suppress it, that opens to me a whole Pandora's box and blinds us to all the things that may be more difficult to do, but are more effective in the long run. So how do we properly advocate and organize around the end of violence and conflict while supporting both Jews and Palestinians? Boy, I wish I knew. I think I think one of the things that I've seen too little about the organizing, and again, there are exceptions to this, and I don't mean to be overly broad, but I've seen, too many examples where people just don't have the sufficient empathy to see the other side. I mean, some of what floored me and a lot of Jews, I think, was the rush on October 7th, without qualification, to say, what Hamas did was an act of resistance, and not look at the horror of what they did, not only the numbers, but the brutality. And what we saw soon afterwards was the glee with which they were, going around hunting Jews. But I also, it's troubled me when I saw the big rally, the pro-Israel rally. And again, I didn't listen to every speech. Maybe I missed it, but I didn't hear the type of concern that I would have hoped for, the Palestinian women and children, innocents who are dying in this. And I know that there are some on the pro-Israel side that say, well, Hamas is responsible for all of it. And in one sense, they are, but they're not, in the sense that Israel's dropping the bombs that are, killing people. So I think that the more that we can organize, but remember that there are human beings on both sides, and hopefully thinking about what's down the road. Again, this is to me different than all the Gaza, Hamas, Israel things in the past. This is probably a paradigm shift, and we don't know how this is going to end. But if I'm going to be an optimist out of a terrible situation, I think that maybe there's a push by the international community for both sides to sort of lose and to have a two-state solution, where not imposed on the Palestinians in a way that's seen as illegitimate, but I think maybe somebody like Omar Barghouti, who's been in an Israeli prison, who's seen as, I wouldn't compare him to a Nelson Mandela, but somebody who would be seen as credible by Palestinians, might be an option down the road. I mean, I don't know, but I think support, if there's something that comes out of this that will at least allow the opportunity for the not only bloodshed to stop, but people to have national self-expression in their own land, and see an interest in building a future together, as opposed to killing each other. That would be a good result. And when things like that start appearing more, to push those things. And there are groups that are pushing for peace, and in Israel and other places, and you can seek those out too. Would you speak more on the consequences of the freedom of speech battles being played out on college campuses? Yeah. What is a college for? It's to teach students to think, and to be disturbed by ideas. So, I detest, as you might imagine, everything that David Duke stands for. I remember back in the 70s, he showed up with a sign, "Kunstler is a communist Jew," with I forgot what outrageous, clothing he was wearing. I mean, it would have been something with a swastika. I don't know, but it was, he had the right to do that. And that gave an opportunity for people to address what he was trying to sell. When on a campus, people are being told that if you're disturbed by an idea, that's the same as violence. If they're being told that, what you should demand are safe spaces, trigger warnings, and, you want to, know what words are okay to use and not. That on one hand, there's some sensible aspect to it. You don't want people to be hurt by things that other people say. But when you try to make this into the binary of rules, or saying that this is the most important thing, that's telegraphing to students that there's a certain things that you can think, and certain things that you can say, and other things you can't. And on an educational mission, what you want to do is create opportunities for students to experiment with ideas and be wrong, and not to feel that they're going to be trucks around like there were in Harvard and Columbia, with saying you're an anti-Semite and trying to, get 18-year-olds never to get a job, or to threaten students, in the other direction. So I see the cultivation of a free speech environment on a campus as critical to the educational mission. And there's some places, like I said, Dartmouth is doing excellent, and Bard is doing very well. But when you have pressure like you had I listened to some of the congressional testimony today, where some of the pushes of the college presidents are, how can you allow this type of speech? The answer should simply be not only just the First Amendment, it's because we're a college and we're going to, teach about it. And we're going to make it sure that students understand there's a distinction between, again, being harassed, intimidated, bullied, and so forth, which we're not going to allow, which will have significant consequences, or to be hearing things that you might find hateful, anti-Semitic, Islamophobic, racist, whatever, and then we're going to use those as educational opportunities. That's the importance of maintaining free speech. But the push by politicians for the adoption of the new definition of anti-Semitism can have a chilling effect on those legitimately criticizing the state of Israel. Have there been cases where the courts have rendered decisions based upon the new definition, e.g., involving BDS? Well, there have been two separate things. There have been cases about requiring certain declarations that you're not going to boycott Israel. It's not around the definition per se, but it's sort of inspired by it in a way. In certain states to be able to have a contract, and there's litigation on that. And I think it's, to me, that's ridiculous. If you're going to give a talk at a place, or do a service, why should you have to say, I'm not going to boycott Israel? I mean, you know that's a problem. In terms of the definition, I think that's going to come up in one of the cases that's percolating at the moment. It may well be the case that was filed a couple of weeks ago about Berkeley, where it was based largely on the scenario that I mentioned with the law students, although it also had some more recent things. And it basically says that, again, that Jews are Zionists, therefore excluding Zionists is anti-Semitic and should be illegal under Title VI. And it uses the definition as part of that. So I think you're going to see some significant litigation. I suspect groups like on one side promoting the use of the definition are going to be groups like the Brandeis Center and the ADL. On the other side, are going to be groups like the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, Center for Constitutional Rights, Palestine Legal, and so forth. And we'll see where the courts go. And my guess is that, at least my putting on my legal hat, is that the use of the definition, if that becomes the cornerstone of one of these cases where an action is taken that hurts a student, hurts a faculty member, or has other consequences that are real, it should be a violation of the First Amendment, especially in the context of a public university, and even schools where there's that are private universities have an interest in academic freedom, and ought to be guided by free speech principles. But we'll see. I mean, that's a case that's going to be coming. How would two states be at all possible now? What about settlers in the West Bank? Wouldn't Hamas, Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad be against those states too, versus their desire for the caliphate? Yeah, I mean, there are certain groups like Hamas and Hezbollah are very clear. They don't want any non-Muslims to have any type of control over any of that land, and that's not necessarily going to change. However, I can't imagine any scenario that would work other than a two-state solution. I was saying before October 7th, I can't imagine Jewish Israelis deciding that they're going to trust their security to a state where they don't have, control over the police, the military, and so forth. And certainly after October 7th, they're not going to give up their idea to control, their destiny. That's why I disagreed with Peter Beinart when he was suggesting a confederation. Although, again, I could be wrong. There may be ways of putting a confederation together that wouldn't, create that fear and would allow for the protection. I think most Palestinians and if you ask them a wish list, would they like to rewind the clock to 1880 and have a very small Jewish population that was a minority except in Jerusalem? Yeah, but they also realize that's not the real world, and that they have to create a situation where both sides can have national self-expression. The Palestinians that I know are right in the sense that continued occupation is immoral, reprehensible, you name it. Um, but perpetual war is not going to be a good thing either. And I think there are enough people on goodwill that eventually, in the right circumstances, I think it's going to take some external prodding, but that's the only way that I could see it. And whether how the land is divided was pretty much. I mean, it came close during Taba. I was talking to people back then in the heyday of when people were positive about what might happen. There were people that were Palestinian and Israeli officials that were sort of joking, walking around Jerusalem with GPSs, talking about this is mine and this is yours. They were almost there in many ways, and ultimately, that's the only of all it's not a great solution, but it's the only one that I see as least bad. Um, and that may be something that comes out of this, because continuing this is going to be untenable.
Well, thank you so much. We've come to the end of the questions for now. And I just want to remind people that Ken Stearns invited you to write to him. So it would be kstern@bard.edu. So please feel free to engage with him that way. And we just want to say thank you so much for being willing to share your deep knowledge of this area, both of hate studies and the specific things that we're living through at the moment, and how these interact, because we have intellectual models, but our intellectual models are subject to our lived experiences at the moment, and we need to keep revisiting both in order to come up with something that makes sense. So thank you so much. Thank you so much. And I don't necessarily need to have the last word. Is there some parting phrase or two, a piece of that you would like to say?
Well, just thank you. I mean, it's always been a pleasure, working with the Montana Human Rights Network. I'm a big fan of what you guys, do. I mean, I've sent students to you, working over the summers. My favorite, was this a student who I had as a freshman in 2016, first semester freshman, who came from Turkey, interested in anti-Semitism. Best student. I mean, English was not his first language. He was great. I sent him on an internship to work with Travis, and he did a lot of the work on the Bundy stuff. And I was delighted that not only did he get the experience of working with Travis, which was remarkable for him, but he also got taken to a rodeo. So, so, I'm a big fan of everything you've done. I've loved sending students, to you guys. And if there's anything I could ever do, please feel free to reach out.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And then to everybody who's still hanging in there, and those who may hear this on the recording when it goes out, we just want to say, please, not only feel free to engage with Ken Stern, but also with the MHRN here in Montana directly. You know, we are not a monolithic group. We like to be good to each other, and we like to listen to each other, and we like to work from a place of heart to try to better human rights in the state. So your your heartfelt thoughts and needs and observations are really, really welcome. We want to hear from you. So thank you so much. And I'm going to say good night in behalf of Montana Human Rights Network and director of the Bard Center for the Study of Hate, Ken Stern. And we'll see you again soon. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you all. Good night.